Hello and welcome to the programme. The US has imposed a new set of sanctions on Russian entities and individuals for trying to influence the 2016 US presidential race. And meanwhile, Russian intelligence officers Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Boshirov were also included in the list for carrying out the nerve agent attack on the Skripals in England. Now, to discuss the outcomes of the new sanctions, we are welcomed to the studio Anton Pechenkin. He's a political analyst. Hello. Thank you so much for coming in, Anton.
Thank you for the invitation.
So when you saw that these new sanctions were imposed on these dozen or so individuals, what was your initial impression? How powerful are these new sanctions, and are they well targeted?
Firstly, I think that these sanctions, they have more symbolic meaning that they some direct impact of it. Because, for example, Petrov and Boshirov, it's hard to imagine that they, after all that happened, they could go to the USA, for example, or put some money to some American bank. So, but the USA demonstrate the very strong course to make sanctions against Russia the harder and stronger with every single time and every single step. So it's just like a picture that America still is going on this way, sanctioning Russia.
And actually, if you take time out to look at the US Treasury press release, a lot of the sanctions are very well targeted, and there they list the exact activities that these people who were sanctioned were up to. For example, for those that were trying to influence the US elections, they were involved in stealing information through cyber attacks or hacking, and then disseminating. Some of them were involved in disseminating information. So do you think that the sanctions policy of the US is still effective? Do you think it's still doing its job, what it was originally meant to do?
Sanctions were planned from the beginning, from the 2014 year when the conflict in the eastern Ukraine began. They were mentioned to press people who are around Putin. For example, some oligarchs or some
well, intelligence officers.
Yes, for example, if we are speaking about intelligence officers, I think it has only a symbolic meaning, no more.
But for others, it's more. Yes. So for other people, perhaps a bit closer to Putin, then the sanctions are causing more harm.
The sanctions is like a message to these people behind Putin that his policy harms them, and that probably they should in some way talk to Putin in order that he should change his policy, for example. But as we can see, also some oligarchs or some people who was close to Yeltsin and still are close to Putin, for example, sanctions against them are delayed, for example.
Yeah, so it's very selective. Actually, I think it's interesting as well how effective these sanctions are. I'm sure there are economic and indicators out there that show the exact impact that the sanctions have. But obviously, we still have Russian troops, like the command and control in the Donbass, who are still operating these militant forces. Yes. So how effective do you think the sanctions are on influencing Russian policy, foreign policy more specifically?
There is a good observation that the modern policy of the USA towards Russia, it's copying the time of Ronald Reagan's administration in that time, as we remember, for example, in the 1980s. Also, America had a very strong sanctions against the Soviet Union. For example, there was a military race of army.
Arms race.
Yes, yes. Thank you. And also there was in that time America was concurring the Soviet Union's policy in the energetics sphere. And now we see that all these repeats all this situation. But in Reagan's time, that was effective and Soviet Union collapsed. But will it work this time? It will be interesting to observe.
Yes.
I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, in that case, so that was over quite a few years, wasn't it? We're not talking, say, 4 or 5 years. Was it?
Some people expect that something in Russia will happen very soon, and really there are some moments that demonstrate that Russia's regime is at crisis. But
why do they say that the Russian regime, or Putin's regime, more specifically, is in crisis?
There are some signs that, for example, Kremlin lose control over a situation. For example, in regions after the pension reform, the ratings of Putin dropped down, and of course there is no some alternative that some leader, for example, I don't think that Navalny could lead the revolution against Putin.
This is very important, actually, because a lot of the time in other media outlets, the Navalny and others are referred to the Russian opposition, but actually in Russia there is no opposition to Putin, like, realistically. So
it's hard to imagine some revolution against Putin because there is no any opposition and no some opposition leader who could lead this revolution against Putin.
So, but I'd ask you again then. So, for example, in the short term, do you think the sanctions have an effect on Russian foreign policy towards its neighbors?
In short term, no, because the sanctions are, of course, they are straightening from time to time, but the sanctions are on the table from 2014, and for 4 years from its beginning, and Russia's economy didn't collapse, and of course there are some impact that is more long term. You know, in 5 years, I don't think that. The sanctions really harmed Russia.
Yeah.
And
but I think it's interesting you say that the sanctions didn't harm Russia. Maybe you disagree, but I don't think the idea of sanctions is that you harm the whole Russian economy. The whole idea of sanctions is that you really target individual people who have assets abroad. Because if you bring down the Russian economy, you have a bigger problem. You have you're going to lose support for yourself anyway, because it's going to be used against you.
Yes. But if speaking about sanctions against some close to the Russian authority, some persons close to Russian authority, of course they can't go to the USA. For example, there is a risk that the European Union or some countries will copy the American decision and also make sanctions against them. But I'm not sure that it has some very serious impact. For example, for Petrov or Boshirov, that they.
Yeah. And also on that list, by the way, on the US Treasury list, you had the people who were sanctioned. It was 17 or 18 now, but also you had a very important note about the sanctions that were lifted against Oleg Deripaska's company, which is the EM Plus Group, and another one, Ruslan, I think, or Rusal. So what sort of message does this send, where you have sanctions being lifted against a billionaire businessman with close ties to the Kremlin, and on the other hand, you have sanctions being imposed on others? So do you think it's just a part of the negotiations or the give and take, or the changing situation?
Probably yes. Deripaska is a very old person in Russian policy. In Yeltsin's time, he was close to the Yeltsin's family, so-called family from the big letter, and he's still close to Putin. And that fact that sanctions against him were cancelled. Yes, I think it's a sign that there are some negotiations that are going through Deripaska, and his some American contacts now they are trying to make him, some person, mediator between America and Putin.
But when you say negotiations, what sort of negotiations? Over what?
Probably, as we know, Putin and Trump, they didn't meet in Buenos Aires when there was G20. But still, after what happened in Kerch Strait, of course, Trump, he couldn't meet Putin.
Yeah,
but they still...
other people said that wasn't... I mean, that was the reason that was given, but actually there was a lot of other issues that Trump had to face internally at that time.
Yes, and probably... for example, probably there are some negotiations about their next meeting or some... of course, it also includes question of Ukraine. Of course, Russia would be very interested that there would be some, big deal between Russia and the USA about Ukraine, about Syria, for example. And it's interesting that probably Deripaska he takes part in such negotiations. I'm not fully in this information, but we will observe.
It's like an idea that
yes,
it could be
it's very interesting to observe what will happen next.
And one final question for you before we run out of time: how do you think? How effective are these sanctions? Do you think in the broader international pressure on Russia?
They could be effective. For example, in Reagan's time, there was not only sanctions, but there was a set of different strong and I would even say aggressive steps of America against the Soviet Union, and they could be very serious and with very serious outcome. But 4 years, they are on the table, but still nothing happened. Yeah. So probably this old Reagan's policy is not working, probably.
So I have to think of a new one fast. Okay. Thank you so much for coming into our studio today.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was Anton Pechenkin. He's a political analyst. You're watching UATV.